Good morning. My name is Amanda Keller, and I'm the Associate Curator of Historic Interiors at the Foundation. Eric and I wanted to share with you some of the ongoing research we are conducting concerning the 1757 probate inventory of Daniel Parke Custis. The Colonial Williamsburg archaeology team is working hard on a 5-year excavation of the Custis Square site. They are also documenting what they learn on the Custis Square Archaeology website, where they share their findings through blog posts and illustrated story maps. Every day they are making new discoveries about how Custis designed his house, outbuildings, and elaborate gardens, and how that fits into the greater Williamsburg story. The house Custis IV constructed by 1717 no longer stands, but through past excavations, we know that the foundations of the main house were roughly 49 feet by 23 feet and made of brick. However, this information leaves us wanting. What did this house look like? What types of objects would you have seen when you walked the halls? And where are those objects today? While we may never know exactly what Custis's house looked like, we do have some clues. The archaeologists have been able to determine that standing at Custis's house gave him a direct view of two impressive brick structures, Bruton Parish Church and the Governor's Palace. Custis purchased the property in 1714, and the house was completed by 1717. At this time, most Virginians lived in houses made of wood. Larger brick mansions were not entirely unknown, but they were not prevalent. However, John Custis IV grew up living in brick houses like Arlington, the home of his grandfather, John Custis II, built on the Eastern Shore, which was one of the most extraordinary 17th century houses known to have ever been built in Virginia. Based on the archaeology and architectural investigations, it is likely that Arlington was 3 stories and had a double pile plan with a footprint that was almost identical to the Governor's Palace. Custis's house in Williamsburg was referred to in the 19th century as the Six Chimneys House, and also may have had some architectural Jacobean design similarities to Bacon's Castle, which was built around 1665 in Surrey County. There is so much to cover, so I won't be able to go into detail today about Custis's tumultuous marriage to Frances Parke, or his rather colorful personality. They had 2 children, Frances and Daniel Parke Custis, with his son being his sole heir. Daniel Parke Custis goes on to marry Martha Dandridge, and they go on to have 4 children, 2 of whom survive. Now, John Custis IV dies in 1749, and his will recorded in England provided many useful details regarding how the estate was divided among his children, including Jack, his child that he fathered with an enslaved woman named Alice. Things get even more complicated when Daniel Parke Custis unexpectedly dies of illness in the summer of 1757, causing the entire Custis estate to be probated. Unfortunately, many Virginia estate inventories were destroyed during the Civil War. The Virginia Confederate government requested that all county courts send their records to a central location in Richmond for safekeeping. When Richmond burned in 1865, these documents were destroyed. The records for James City County, which makes up a large portion of the city of Williamsburg, were lost in this fire. The York County records are an especially valuable survival for those researching the Williamsburg area, as officials did not comply with the request to send the records to Richmond and instead hid the documents for the duration of the war. We are fortunate to have many surviving probate inventories for York County, which includes some of our exhibition buildings we interpret today, such as the Peyton Randolph House, Raleigh Tavern, Weatherburn's Tavern, and the Governor's Palace. Now here's where things get really interesting. In 1984, a 42-page folio ledger was discovered in storage at Washington and Lee University. Once the leaves were ordered in the correct sequence, they realized that they had a complete ledger in which George Washington, in his own hand, preserved copies of reports and accounts submitted to the General Court during his administration of Daniel Parke Custis's estate and his guardianship of its heirs from 1759 to 1773. Now, why would he take the time to do that? Well, George Washington married Martha Custis, Daniel's widow, in 1759, and he needed to be able to account for the estate for the Custis heirs. The Washington and Lee ledger was originally part of the collection of papers and heirlooms that descended from the Custis and Washington families to Mary Custis Lee. When she was forced to abandon her home in 1861, she shipped her family relics by wagon first to Richmond and then later on to Lexington for safekeeping. When Union troops were approaching in 1864, the documents and objects, including the family silver, were buried. She later recalled that the buried papers were destroyed by mold and damp and were perfectly illegible. The papers were deposited with the Custis Papers at the Virginia Historical Society in 1897 and were withdrawn in 1907 and given to Washington and Lee University, where the ledger resides today. Luckily for us, Washington copied the probate inventories for all of the Custis properties, including the James City estate, which was referred to by Washington as taken in the house of John Custis in Williamsburg, and was probated by John Blair, Peter Scott, and John Prentice. It is always exciting to discover a Williamsburg probate inventory that describes the main house room by room and really allows us to use our imaginations as to how this house was laid out and furnished. In addition to the main house, it also described the contents of the 5 outbuildings, including the kitchen, granary, salt house, coach house, and store loft. We also know that 2 enslaved women lived in the kitchen and were named Cornelia and Beck. Now, when you first walked into the main house, you would have encountered a main passage and staircase, which would have been very grand. The walls would have been covered with over 50 pieces of artwork, including maps, framed prints, and paintings. The prints appear to reference classical history topics, such as the Caesars and the battles fought by Alexander the Great. This space was meant to impress and show off Custis's collection. He was a collector, after all. He was a collector of art, books, plant specimens, and even medicinal recipes, and much, much more. If you went up the stairs, you would have found 2 elegantly furnished bedchambers. The right-hand bedchamber had more expensive textiles on the bed than the left-hand room. These spaces also offered many chairs for visitors. We know his brother-in-law, William Byrd, often stayed with Custis when he was in town, and it is likely he slept in the right-hand bedchamber. This room also listed trunks for storage, like you see here on the screen, as well as a clothes chest where extra bed linens would have been stored. Now, if we go back down the staircase, we would encounter 2 main entertaining rooms. The chamber appears to be where John Custis probably slept, as his room was valued at 25 pounds and had the most expensive bed hangings on the entire probate inventory. This room also had 50 pieces of wall art and would have been used by Custis as an office featuring his escritoire, probably similar to what you see here on the screen. He could have also used this space for entertaining if the table in the hallway was brought in and the 9 chairs were used. He had a closet that had drinking and dining equipage, as well as a well-stocked library adjoining his space, as Custis was a collector of books as well. Now, if we exit the chamber and cross to the main passage, we would enter into the hall, which was the room that had the most valuable furnishings listed in the inventory, at just over 30 pounds. The hall would have been Custis's main room for entertaining. It also had 2 closets, which could be referring to built-in bofats, where much of the family silver and valuable drinking equipment would have been displayed and used as needed. This space had a dining table, a marble slab table, possibly this one made by Peter Scott that survives in the Smithsonian collection, and many teacups and saucers for entertaining. Our curator of maps and prints, Katie McKinney, wrote a great blog article on the Ferber flower and fruit pieces listed in this room and is working to further analyze the artwork featured throughout this probate inventory. Since I cannot show you exactly how this room arrangement in the hall would have looked, there is a similar space seen here at Bacon's Castle. Now, if you went downstairs into the cellars, you may have encountered a small room Custis used as his apothecary, as he was very interested in experimenting with medicinal formulas and curing different ailments. The rest of the cellar was used for alcohol and food storage for the entertainment of his guests. The probate inventory then leads us out to the kitchen, where the types of objects like this copper chocolate pot is listed and used to make things like chocolate, which was often consumed for breakfast and believed to have medicinal benefits. And this is also where the 2 enslaved women, Cornelia and Beck, lived and worked on the estate. From the way the probate inventory described the contents, it did not appear that this house was being heavily used or lived in. I think the information we can glean from this probate inventory is that John Custis IV built a very elegant house with good furnishings in 1717, but by the time that the probate was taken after his son Daniel's death in 1757, the furnishings were considered old and outdated. In fact, this may be why much of the estate was sold at auction, with remaining items possibly disposed of in the well, with Martha ultimately deciding not to take many of these possessions with her to her new home at Mount Vernon. I will now turn the podium over to my colleague Eric so he can share even more discoveries.
Hello everyone, my name is Eric and I'm a staff archaeologist here at Colonial Williamsburg, and over the last year or so I've been working with Amanda to try and wring as much information as we can out of the inventory document as part of the archaeology department's ongoing excavation at Custis Square site. We began by comparing the rooms as they're described in the inventory to the archaeological remains of the structures that were found at Custis Square when it was first excavated in the 1960s. However, it quickly became clear that since earlier excavation was only focused on a small portion of the property, we won't be able to determine the exact floor plan of the house or its outbuildings until our current excavations of the site are completed. In the meantime, we decided to do some more research on John Custis's household furnishings listed in the inventory. We found that due to the unusually complete nature of the documentary record, as Amanda was just saying, we could actually trace where many of the objects ended up across Virginia following Daniel Parke Custis's death. Drawing upon this research, we've created an online story map which allows members of the public to follow individual objects from their original locations in the house at Custis Square to their new owners' houses across Williamsburg, the Middle Peninsula, and the Virginia colony. One of the unusual aspects of the inventory is that after it was created, the Custis family lawyer, John Mercer, went through and numbered each item. These numbers correspond with another list which Mercer made when showing who inherited each of the objects, in order to demonstrate that Daniel Parke Custis's estate was equally divided between his son, John, his widow, Martha, and his widow's new husband, George. Mercer only went to these lengths because the Custis family was embroiled in a long-running legal battle over their inheritance with the heirs of Daniel's grandfather's semi-legitimate offspring from Antigua. While the Caribbean claimants never actually secured a piece of the Custis fortune, they waged a legal battle which lasted for more than 5 decades, which I personally appreciate since it has provided us with a unique record of the disposal of John Custis's household furnishings. Mercer's lists are most intriguing because in addition to showing who inherited the object, they also mark if the object was sold and to whom. Most of the furnishings in John Custis's house in Williamsburg were sold in an estate sale, which took place sometime between October 1759, a few years after Daniel's death. Joseph Valentine, the overseer of one of Custis' plantations near Williamsburg, served as the auctioneer at the estate sale and wrote down who purchased which lots. The majority of the objects were bought by local Williamsburg merchants, presumably to be resold at their stores, but quite a few other people from around Williamsburg and the Virginia colony attended the auction and selected a few pieces for themselves. Mercer linked Valentine's sale list to his own, allowing us to connect items which were in the house at Custis Square when it was inventoried to the person who bought that item at the estate sale. Drawing upon this information, along with other documentary sources associated with Custis, we were able to do research into both the people who purchased each object and the objects themselves. It was this information that we used to create our story map. On our story map, we drew a line between Custis Square and the place where the object ended up, with a photo of the object from our collection, which is most similar to the type of object that Custis would have owned. When viewers click on the line, they can view a larger photo of the object, as well as a short description of what it was, where it was placed in the Custis Square house, and the person who acquired it. I would like to thank all the curators here at Colonial Williamsburg who have helped us select the objects from the collections which most closely match Custis's household furnishings. For the remainder of this talk, I would like to show you some of the most interesting links that we found as we created the story map. The first episode of dispersal actually occurred before John Custis died and involves several pieces of engraved silver. Anne Moody and her husband, Matthew, ran an ordinary at Capitol Landing that John Custis regularly patronized when he's traveling between his home in Williamsburg and his large tobacco plantation along the York River north of town called Queens Creek. While the Moody's relationship with Custis was initially contentious, by the end of John's life they had become close enough that Custis left Anne an allowance of £5 annually in his will. According to Anne, a few years before his death, John Custis invited her to his house in Williamsburg. When she arrived, he presented her with a set of silver plates which were engraved with his coat of arms. You can see the silver plates here, and then the coat of arms which is on his tomb right there. These plates were almost certainly the set that Custis inherited from his father and were noted in the elder Custis's will. The Custis coat of arms includes 3 parrots, and it is engraved on the tomb right there. When Anne initially refused to take the dishes, saying that they rightfully belonged to his son, Custis became angry and said that if she didn't take them, he would, quote, throw them out into the street, end quote, rather than allow his new daughter-in-law, Martha, to have them. The inventory indicates that Custis's silver diningware was kept in the right-hand closet in the hall, but for many years, the plates with the Custis coat of arms were displayed in the public room at Moody's Ordinary. Our only knowledge of this whole affair comes from a few pages of a deposition, which is all that survives of a court case in which Daniel sued the Moody's, presumably over his father's silver. The rest of the documents associated with the case appear to have been burned during the Civil War, so the ultimate fate of Custis's family silver is currently unknown. The next link involves Joseph Valentine, the overseer and auctioneer. Since Daniel and Martha continued to live at the White House plantation in New Kent County following John Custis's death, they hired Valentine to oversee the operation of the Queens Creek plantation near Williamsburg. According to contract between Valentine and Daniel, Valentine was charged to stop in and check up on the people at Custis Square, quote, when his business allowed. So this includes the people, including Cornelia and Beck, who Amanda mentioned, who were presumably living there, presumably in the kitchen, at the time that the probate inventory was taken. Interestingly, Cornelia and Beck were also listed on the Queens Creek inventory, indicating that they traveled back and forth between the 2 properties, possibly with Valentine. Valentine continued to work for Martha and George Washington after Custis's death, and he continued to manage the house in Williamsburg throughout his tenure. And at the estate sale, he is noted as purchasing 8 low leather chairs and 3 maps. The maps and at least some of the chairs come from the right-hand room upstairs, which was furnished as a bedroom, as Amanda talked about. Did Valentine sleep in this upstairs room while in Williamsburg and buy the chairs and maps because of their familiarity? Low-backed leather-bottom chairs, such as the one in our collection, would have been old-fashioned in the mid-18th century. So it is likely that the personal connection which attracted Valentine to the chairs rather than their monetary value. Online story maps are one of the ways that we have made our ongoing research and excavation at the Custis Square site accessible to the public. These story maps allow people from all over the world to follow Custis family's journey from England to Virginia or explore the layers of soil and artifacts found in the Custis Well during the 1960s excavation. Since they are entirely online, story maps are an effective way to engage and educate the public, even if they cannot physically travel to Colonial Williamsburg. And I encourage you to view some of our story maps, including the one Amanda and I have created, when you virtually visit Colonial Williamsburg yourself. Thank you very much.